Welcome to the Alchemy Consulting Group podcast. Join Arquella Hargrove, Alchemy's Chief Culture Officer, for impactful conversations with business leaders and experts who are committed to transforming their work cultures and creating inclusive work environments. Let's learn, develop, and garner best practices together. Enjoy this episode.
Welcome to another episode of the Alchemy Consulting Group podcast, where we distill conversations with thought leaders to bring you transformative insights and strategies. Our mission to revolutionize organizational cultures one business at a time. Join us as we explore vital topics that empower leaders, galvanize teams, and reshape the world of work. Let the alchemy begin. And we have the fabulous Dr. Jobi Martinez, who is the Chief Diversity Officer with Harris Health System here in the greater Houston area. And so, Dr. Jobi, share who you are, and we're excited to have you, right? And all that you do, right, is wonderful. So we're looking forward to having a conversation.
Great, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Excited to be part of the alchemy today.
Awesome. So, Jobi, if you can share just high level, just to introduce yourself to the audience and what you do and a little bit of your genius.
Sure. Thank you for that. My name is Jobi Martinez, and you probably already heard, you all call me as Dr. Jobi, so I do have a Ph.D. in media and communication, hence the Dr. Jobi. I was born and raised in Muleshoe, Texas, a very small West Texas town, just a little bit north of Lubbock. Made my way to Houston a few years ago. Have been in and out of Houston for a bit, and then finally now back where I serve as the Chief Diversity Officer for Harris Health System. And so glad to be back in this space, glad to be doing DEI work, and really excited about the space and place we find DEI and ourselves as leaders, as professionals, and not just CDOs, but where organizations find themselves these days, and the work that still lies ahead.
Well, again, excited to have the conversation with you, Jobi. I know we've had many conversations, right? And definitely want to have you to share as that DEI expert, why did you decide to pursue a PhD in media and communications? I love this story, y'all. So I'm looking forward to Jobi to share.
Well, part of that journey. Oh, I'm sorry, Arquella.
No, go ahead. You're good.
No, so part of that journey begins with, how did I even get into DEI? It's not something that I studied in college. It's not like I was an undergrad and told my parents I'm going to be a chief diversity officer someday. It really was finding my space and place in college as an undergrad, and it was communication. And so my undergrad was public relations, and ended up in DEI work just because the jobs that I got into right out of college were like, hey, you might know something about diversity. Again, back then it wasn't called DEI, it was diversity, just in general, the umbrella term. And, whether that was assistance with recruitment, community engagement, et cetera, I kind of became that person. And so, again, when people ask how I got into this work, I often attribute it to, the color of my skin, my last name, et cetera. But I found this work to be really aligned with public relations. So if you're not familiar with public relations, it is a form of strategic communication. So a lot of people think like, public relations, you might think Sex and the City because Samantha was a public relations expert, and some degree, right? But it does involve strategic communication, marketing, advertising, event planning, all of that. But it's really targeting and getting to know your publics. And so I think that gave me the basis for why I went into media and communication as a PhD. Having spent probably a dozen years in the DEI space, I kept arguing, again, I was in higher education. So in higher education, to get promoted, you need more degrees, right? So I needed a PhD to look for at least a assistant VP or some type of promotion. And I went to my boss, who was a chief diversity officer, Dr. Juan Munoz, still a great friend, great mentor of mine, and said, okay, it's about time. Well, he's actually the one that came to me and said, it's about time you start that PhD. So I chose media and communication because over my years, I just noticed the strategic communication tools you needed to engage in the buy-in of why diversity is important, to engage people to help with understanding. And then it was also at the time, we did a lot of multiculturalism. I'll use the kind of that term work where we were doing History Heritage Month celebrations or just recognizing student populations, faculty populations. So there was a lot of public relations in that. And so I wanted to answer the question, how do we as diversity leaders on college campuses utilize strategic communication to move the needle forward or to advance DEI? And so a lot of people thought it was a bit perplexing, maybe that, because usually CDOs or higher ed leaders get into education, psychology, counseling, ed leadership. And I said, no, I'm going media and communication. And it took some convincing, it took convincing some folks that this is the right field. But anyways, not to make that answer any longer. Now you can also see why I went into media and communication. So I always have the running joke, can you guess why I got in trouble K through 12? What I got in trouble for, and it was talking too much. And so hence, Dad, it all paid off. I am now a PhD in media and communication.
But you talk, Jobi, in such a calming voice.
Aw, thank you.
And always so positive. I can't imagine you got in trouble for it, but I'm sure that did happen.
Quite a bit, actually, quite a bit.
Well, and I guess just to kind of pick up on that, but maybe just, Jobi, centering it back to almost like the day-to-day and just in business in general, communication is either the thing that is amplifying and powering to new levels of innovation, new levels of profitability, or it's that thing that can be broken, right? And causing for businesses not to perform at an optimal level. So from your vantage point, what are some organizations that are doing it right? What are they doing strategically in the space of communications? And I'll say strategically, but also tactically too. What are some of those best practices on a macro and micro level that some of our listeners can at least process and determine if they can take them back to their organizations?
So I love that question, and I'll speak a little bit to the consulting work I did before I joined Harris Health, but also Harris Health. Some of the work that I did as a consultant was really looking at DEI communication. So I assessed, I offered opportunities, resources. Something that organizations, I think, do well or do right on this path or this journey to get communication right is to assess their communication. Oftentimes, communication plans are drawn up without assessing what is currently out there. So in the DEI space, I worked with a really great organization in the California area. They were a federal credit union. And what I really enjoyed about them was they took the time and they utilized whatever resources they needed to make that assessment happen. So we pulled everything, images, text, emails. This was after George Floyd. And so anything that they sent out regarding that incident, and then anything following, right? So it was a true assessment of all communications. It was very lengthy, but they were invested in it. And so not only did they invest in the assessment, but what some of the findings from that assessment was, of course, there's bias in communication. There's bias in pretty much all communication. And in some ways it's intentional because of how we frame a message. What is the message we want to put out? What is it that we want people to buy into, to believe, to purchase, etc. So once we started to locate these negative biases, though, in the way that framed communities in a certain way, and again, this could be in the DEI space, this could just be in a consumer space, a patron, a customer kind of space, but they decided to do even more work into looking at where is that missing link, or where is that activity happening that's causing us to bias, or for there to be bias in our communication and negatively communicate about audiences. And maybe negative is not the right word, but there was kind of a deficit communication around certain communities. And so it was quite interesting. The second part of that, and again, I say second or third maybe, is not just the continued assessment, but admitting that, hey, we could do better. Hey, we didn't realize this was happening. But also saying, let's do this. We got it wrong. Now we're coming back. Why did we get it wrong? But constantly looking for opportunity and looking for ways to evolve. I think the things that organizations often hurt themselves with is that you have communication leaders who, as experienced as they may be, carry out communication plans in a way that doesn't involve feedback and it doesn't involve assessment. I do know that in advertising and marketing, you're kind of trained to have like a pilot or a test market. And it's really important that that also happen. But I would say that engaging in the assessment is a win because you're evaluating who your audiences are, who your employees are, whoever it is you're communicating to, finding out what their needs are, finding out what their communication styles are, so that you can have effective communication, whether that's internally with your staff and employees or externally with stakeholders, customers, consumers, et cetera. I think that that's key, but also listening to outsiders, outside experts. Because again, we as communication leaders or whoever we are in the organization, we often silo ourselves and kind of think that because we've done it for a while, we know how to do it. We know our organization. We've been here 25 years. I can do this. I know what we should be saying or putting out there. And our world is highly evolving every day with technology. Now add AI to that communication and it becomes a bit more challenging.
Yeah, like someone said, that communication is definitely the language of leadership, right? And so those are great strategies and things to consider, right, Jobi, as we look at, again, how do we elevate our communication skills? How do we make sure that we are, right, communicating in a way that's going to be appropriate at different levels and helping to drive change, whatever is happening within the organization. Again, making sure, again, that communication is on point. Think about on the opposite side of that, when you think about what are some of those common communication outages that are happening within organizations, and how do we, especially as leaders, avoid some of that?
So I would say that I kind of referenced one earlier, that sort of blanket approach, right? That we think we're going to cast out this communication and everyone's going to receive it or translate it. And I don't mean language, but like the way you receive it, the way you frame it, process it, we're all going to get the message. And we may not always. I'll give you a silly example. Yesterday I was texting with a friend and he just replied, "I'm in the studio." And I said, "Whoa, I didn't mean to interrupt your day," right? Like that was my tone in the reply. His reply was, "How did you get all of that from my text of I'm in the studio? I'm just letting you know I'm in the studio." It's like, don't let me bother you in your day, right? So communication is complex. And if you don't provide the context, if you don't provide communication in a way that all of your audiences, it is not a one-all approach, one blanket approach, one size fits all, maybe that's the right thing to say, that you really need to invest in sort of diverse ways of communication. I would say that's one outage. Another outage that I've seen, this is more in the DEI space, is trying DEI communication and thinking, what I see quite a bit is people read something online or they've attended a conference session or, they, again, Googled and found this is how to do DEI communication. And so they do it and then they wonder why it's not either landing or it's backfiring. Over the last several years when I was a consultant, I had to come in and assist organizations who missed the mark, let's call it that. And a lot of times they missed the mark because they started to overrepresent DEI. And so in the communication space, there are terms for this type of overrepresentation, and then they started to alienate certain communities because they weren't communicating in a way that was authentic. They just thought we need to have more of XYZ because then we look inclusive. So in that trying to look inclusive, it can go wrong. And so again, that's another outage in and of itself. As we talked a little bit about George Floyd, another one was, and you're seeing this is an HR trend just because I heard this the other day too, is when there is an event, whether that's state, local, national, or global, so what's going on across the globe with the different conflicts, employees or stakeholders want you to make a comment on that. They want to know where you stand as an organization because we talk so much about an organization and what we value that we also want to hear how you process and think about what's going on in the world. So You may have heard around George Floyd, some companies made statements, some didn't. Some made them too late. Some made them, some made comments or some made promises, and they were heavily scrutinized after that. And so I think that's another outage. And that's part of not knowing who your audiences are or how to respond or communicate. And there's a lot of learning that still needs to happen in the DEI sort of communication space. But those are just a few of the outages that I can think of. And I like how you frame that kind of a communication outage. Sometimes we think, we think about electricity and outages and we've in Houston, of course, we've been through a couple of those here recently, but you think out, right, that you can't do anything while you're in that space. And there's absolutely a lot that you can do in an outage. It's preparing for the next, potential, or preparing for it not to happen again, or assessing just what's in the environment right now that can help me get to the next place. And so always when there's an outage, always look to move beyond that outage is also essential.
Definitely. I always think about having that contingency plan, right? And what's
Yeah.
the contingency plan, right? When we do have those outages, so we'll be prepared, to your point. For the next time, for sure. But the key is, again, understanding the audience is key. I can tell you how many times, right? And we've had these conversations where people did not understand the audience. And again, the communication it went flat. So Definitely that's key. And you alluded to this, talking about, communication as relates to DEI. And so really talk about, for us, Jobi, about the linkage between an effective communication strategy and DEI and the overall people culture, right? What does that look like? What might that sound like?
Mm-hmm. So when we think about communication in general, or especially organizational communication, it can be difficult to say this is organizational communication or this is DEI communication, because really these days we're emphasizing inclusion and belonging. And that's part of any organization's mission, or their values, or what they'd like to see in their culture. And so making sure that you have the appropriate messages around inclusion are essential. So how does that happen? I hate to go back to this, but it's assessing. Why do people feel included? Why do they not feel included? But it's also about understanding where, if human resources, and I know sometimes they're called something different in organizations, where are they in the organization? How are they viewed? Are they viewed as inclusion strategists, or are they viewed as the place where people go to if there's a problem, right? Or to report someone, or a benefits, right? It's also having an understanding of what is that central office that is central to any organization and the success of organization. How is it viewed? Because you want them to be viewed as inclusion strategists, equity strategists, right? That they have the knowledge and the capacity and also the communication abilities to communicate that across an organization, that this is who we are, this is what we see, this is who we are, this is what we value, and this is why we want you to come to us. Yes, all things HR, but we're here to make sure we advance equity and inclusion and a sense of belonging at this organization. And I think that's where the blurring and the blending happens to come in, but it has to be a strategic blending for that to be successful.
Well, and I love your term blending. And when I think about it, though, Jobi, in large organizations, the leaders over communications, DEI, people culture, HR, they're not the same person, right?
No.
So it comes back to, and Arquella, I know you're very passionate about the currency of collaboration, but how do you advise leaders of those different business segments to learn to collaborate for the good?
Goodness, that is such a great question, because it's a difficult one to answer. You're absolutely right in the sense that they're not all the same people, nor do their experiences cross or align in many ways. I can't tell you, and I know that my CEO and my organization allow me to be transparent. It's that I sometimes go, why don't you listen to me? I have background in communication, strategic DEI communication. Our patient and employee population is diverse. Why aren't strategic leaders listening to me? And I think that's the first step, is going beyond the sort of siloing effect of, oh, well, that's the communications leader, that's the DEI leader, that's the HR leader. We tend to silo ourselves, self-silo sometimes, but sometimes the organization silos us. and doesn't bring us together for collaboration on that, on a central concept. And the concept is communication. A lot of things. So even as we think about my organization, if we think about patient safety, if we think about preventative health, all of that is centered around communication, but we don't often think about it that way. We think about it in a, that's ambulatory services over there, or that's population health. So we cast it to a department without thinking about what is that central element. The central element is people, it's communication. And again, I'm going to sprinkle in our vision and values, right? All of that is part of that. But part of that is just organizational structures. Organizations tend to structure themselves and silo themselves. And even as we talk about who the leaders are, well, all your leaders are subject matter experts in something, right? And we tend to silo them in that space without really listening to how diverse the experiences and backgrounds and knowledge and abilities and competencies and all of that a single individual can bring. And this is where I think, as we have conversations about collaboration and innovation, again, it goes back to inclusiveness. Are we including not only all the voices, but are we allowing them to say more than what we think they should be saying in terms of, well, that's only HR, right? HR has a plethora of diverse experiences to bring forward. Or even in my space, well, she's only DEI, but I have a strong background in community engagement and communications. And sometimes we don't allow, because we move so fast as organizations and we want to get to the end goal so quickly, sometimes we don't allow for that. Again, it's strategic communication, and it does revolve around inclusion.
Well said, Jobi. No, this is great. I was like leaning in because it's like, okay, no, this is great, right? This is needed. Every organization, right, needs to hear that. And again, that collaboration needs to happen because, as you both have heard me say, right, we cannot do this work by ourselves, and definitely you need, right, DEI, you need comms, you need HR, right, to make sure that it's happening successfully, for an organization. Jobi, when you think about the skills or the traits or experiences, for a comms leader, what would you share? What would that look like for the future? Thinking about, again, those skills and traits and experience, what would that look like for the future for a comms leader or someone who's aspiring to be a comms leader?
So I think something that has helped me in my space, and I've seen other strategic communications officers also have this, is that they have kind of a diverse background, a myriad of experiences. So they weren't always in communications. They were, maybe in service receivables or something. I'm trying to think of like a good manufacturing kind of title.
Okay.
They may have been in different pockets of the university, and maybe let me use higher education because that's where I have quite a bit of my experience. For myself, I was a recruiter first, and that was one of my first professional jobs. Actually, no, my first job was community engagement at a contemporary art gallery. And then I went on to be a recruiter. And then from a recruiter, I went on to be an academic advisor. From an academic advisor, I went on to student life. And then from there, I just had different positions throughout the university. So it gave me different optics of an organization. So as I evolved eventually into a DEI leader, I knew what it looked like in every part of those sort of areas that I could speak to them. I think oftentimes we do this with resumes, and I was just on a call earlier. You look at a resume and you hope to see something linear that shows growth in a particular position. We don't often appreciate the diversity of experiences that someone may bring because they have had different positions within the same organization or maybe different organizations, but what they bring is diversity of experience and that value. And I think that that's part of it, because I think that if you have a linear, now I'm not saying that there aren't successful, chief communications officers that have linear pathways. I'm saying that one of those skills or traits needs to be being open to learning more and learning more about new spaces, new places, new areas or departments that are in your organization. It's getting up and rounding, something that we use in the healthcare term. It's getting up to visit other people, sit in different meetings, sit in different, activities, so that you have a well-rounded or somewhat well-rounded understanding of your organization, your community, or in general of the world, right? Because then you can speak to what are great communication opportunities or what are some of our communication gaps. But you're not the only one speaking to that. Again, as a comms officer, your role is also to listen to others in the room. That is strategic communication. That is public relations. So that's another trait that I would emphasize is a great listener, great collaborator. I don't often use this word, but empathy, like being an empathetic leader. And that doesn't always mean, we often think about sort of the emotional end of empathy. Empathy is also just understanding and understanding where people are, whether they're a part of the organization or are outside of the organization. It's really valuable to have an empathetic leader because that also means that they're listening and that they're paying attention to those equity pieces that are part of strategic communication. So just kind of right off the top of my head there, those are some traits or skills that I would associate with being a great communications leader.
Well, and everything that you described, Jobi, I think are natural giftings for you.
Oh, thank you.
And, even just down to the empathy that you just referenced near the end. And I will also add your amazing sense of humor. So one day we'll just have to have a podcast with all the Jobi-isms, right? And just, some of the doozies we've heard through the years. But tell us, Jobi, if you could go back in time. I know you mentioned a pivotal moment with your mentor, the prompting to get your Ph.D. But what's some career advice that you would give yourself, your younger self, now? Like, what would you go back and tell her? Because you've accomplished so much, but it's easy for us to look in and say, oh, she made it look so easy. But I know there were probably times when it didn't feel easy. It didn't feel fluid. So what advice would you give yourself?
I was about to say be willing to jump, but I feel like that's what I've done. So I've had those moments where my parents were like, what do you mean you walk out of your job today? Like, I did. I think I'll find something better, or I'll find something that's more aligned with what I want to do. And so most of my career has been jumping. Even when I rolled off to get my PhD, I left a great full-time job that I wasn't happy in. I was not happy at all. But I left it to get the PhD because I knew that was the next step that I wanted to take. But people are always surprised with, like, you left a full-time job to become a full-time student. Again, fully transparent, not married. I did that, I was single. But I know there are a lot of people out there who are diverse backgrounds. Single moms do this all the time, and single parents, single, et cetera, caregivers, et cetera. Some people have 2 or 3 jobs and they do this. So I do want to acknowledge that. But at that time, that was who I was and what I did. I regretted that decision for a long time. And it only took me until recently to say, that wasn't a bad decision after all. Like, I think you made the right decision in whatever space you've landed. And I think that if I could go back again, I would tell myself to jump. But then sometimes I waver on that, like, why did you jump? But then I like, oh yeah, you jumped. So that's part of it. That's a really tough question to answer. I think what I would tell myself, the professional advice that I would give myself, back to my earlier self, is that, I know you've already asked me this question. For some reason, I feel like I had an answer. Now I'm pondering it again. Is to be louder. And as I talk about being in trouble K through 12 for talking too much, I sometimes don't think I advocated for myself enough as a professional. I know that I come to DEI with a different lens than most chief diversity officers. I know that I have a different rationale, different research. And I think also too at Harris Health, they get a little maybe frustrated because I'm like, nope, we're not following that trajectory. This is what we need. But it's not in the books. It's not in the research. Yeah, because we are going to be the first ones to write that, right? So I think it would be just to have been a little bit louder in my career. I didn't always allow myself to be, I let other people speak for me. And I just think back like, and maybe this sounds a bit selfish or egotistical, and I don't mean it to be, but I could have done more to advocate for how DEI should be done. And I think that if maybe I would have had a stronger voice, I could have lent my voice to these challenges that we're having now with, government, politics, these social, political understandings of what DEI is. And I think that is what I would go back and tell myself, is to be louder, be a louder champion, but also be a louder champion for myself, because I know that I come into this space with a little bit of different knowledge or frameworks than most people have about DEI work. And yeah.
What I appreciate about that, Jobi, is that you've taken us down to just a common element. Be louder, right? Like, forget advocacy for a moment, forget allyship, forget all that. Just speak, right? And speak at an audible level, and maybe even building on that, live out loud a little bit more. So I love that advice. And I like the jump. Maybe it's jump with a little bit of thought. I don't know. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with jumping, but it seems like maybe there was just a moment where maybe it was a hop that you needed and not a full jump. I don't know, but love that advice too.
Yeah, that was great. Jobi, yeah, definitely is continuing to use your voice. And yeah, as we affectionately also refer to Jobi, she's this data scientist, researcher, right? All about framing. And so it's definitely continuing to use your voice. It's needed. And yeah, thank you for the great work that you're doing and even yet to do. So definitely excited that we had a chance to have this conversation with you.
Yes, best part of the day, Jobi. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. Awesome. Well, that definitely wraps up another dialogue conversation here at the Alchemy Consulting Group podcast. And thank you all for tuning in and engaging with us on this journey towards enriching organizational cultures and leadership. And remember that each conversation is a step towards transformation. And we ask you all to continue to lead and innovate and thrive until we connect again. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Jobi. Thank you for tuning in to the Alchemy Consulting Group podcast. Follow this podcast on social media and help continue the conversation by sharing your business and leadership best practices. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours, and share this podcast with your organizations and networks. Let's strengthen the community of those committed to responsible leadership and work environments where everyone can thrive.